To South Africa. Mr. Khomo, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me, man.
Now, before we get into the meeting, let's look at what was taking place outside, those protests that we saw by a handful of DRC nationals. Are you surprised by those protests?
Well, knowing the DRC people, I'm not surprised. I know them very well. I've been to their meetings, I've been to their gatherings in many places, and they always end up in hullabaloo. You know, the DRC people, they are people who tend to take things to heart, yeah, and they tend to be emotional. And then you look at what are the issues at the bottom of the thing there. It is some of them are very trivial. So basically, that's typical DRC character.
Speaking of typical DRC character, I mean, some of the things that they were saying was that, you know, the president is illegitimate, he's got no right to speak on their behalf. Is it really based on nothing that they feel this way, considering the delay of the elections?
You know, that's the thing that has been said by the mainstream media, and funny enough, some very respectable media groups have been talking about that. Nations have been talking about that. But I think they've got to really go and look at the constitution of the DRC. The constitution of the DRC, when it was actually formulated, it was formulated by the people of the DRC, not even by Kabila's group in 2006. Now, in the constitution of the DRC, it says specifically that a president can only be a president for only 2 terms. That's granted. But the same constitution further went, and it actually talks about ways of which power is going to be handed over. The same constitution says that the presidency is going to be given to an elected president. And the same constitution says that in a situation where there is no elected president, the incumbent continues up to a time when a president is elected. It is the same constitution. And that constitution was not crafted or drafted by the Kabila government.
Thank you.
Now we can come to tell you what issues led to the delay.
Yes.
Now that's another issue.
And I think that's an important one. But before we look at that, and I want us to look at that a little bit later on, because these protests, I mean, they do bring about a lot of issues. Let's look at the significance of this meeting that was had between South Africa and the DRC, considering the relations between the countries. Your take on that?
Well, Kabila is going out, and I think it's the right time when they've actually got to come and review the meetings. As you heard, that this is the 10th or 11th, I didn't hear it very well. They've been happening throughout it's a bilateral thing. South Africa's got bilateral commissions with many countries, which again, it's a sad thing because basically the DRC, it's a SADC country. South Africa is a SADC country. Why should 2 SADC countries members have bilateral agreements? Yeah. In fact, it just shows that SADC is still weak, whereby we are supposed to have a SADC region with agreements, trade agreements or whatever. And basically, these are things that have been going on. And as you heard, they're looking at issues of movement of people between the 2 countries. I think open borders, taxation, trade, and the like. But I think the most important thing that Kabila came to talk to the South Africans, he came to ask them for assistance in the coming elections. You know, the DRC elections have always been problematic, and that's the reason why I mean to say that Kabila is where he is, and not only that, where the Electoral Commission of the DRC is where it is. I mean, if you've got time, we can talk about that. DRC is a very big country. From east to west, or west to east, that's from the Kinshasa to Goma. The distance is the same as from Johannesburg to Dar es Salaam. That will take you 3 hours by a jet. And in 3 hours flying over the DRC, you're still in the same country. And it's almost the same distance, north to south. And in that situation, you've got the logistics. Yeah, there's not much road transportation with elections to distribute the ballot election material, to collect them. The logistics is really frightening. And South Africa is a country that has helped the DRC in its elections on 2 occasions. And I think they're coming back to come and ask South Africa to come and assist. Because again, that the DRC promised a lot of assistance by donor countries. And we can talk about that. but that assistance has not been coming.
I'm actually glad you mentioned the part about them, coming to South Africa essentially to ask for assistance during the elections. Do you think this is a start for a roadshow of sorts for Kabila? Will he be going to other countries, or is he just going to come to South Africa, considering that you said we have assisted 2 other times before?
I don't know. It's up to them. You see, with the DRC elections, let's go back to the elections. I mean to say that the demonstrators say that the man has delayed the elections. But to take it to a point is this, that in the 211 elections, they were a mess. And they were a mess principally because that the Electoral Commission was underfunded. And again, there were donor organizations which said they were going to assist, but they never came up. And the government said they were going to go ahead holding the elections. And it was a real mess. And the same donor countries came up and condemned the elections. Now, after the 211 elections, the Electoral Commission, it's made up mostly of opposition parties. They came up very strongly and said that they've got to come and revise the whole issue of elections. And they brought in the United Nations, which was to help the Electoral Commission to reframe the electoral process. So the United Nations was there as the chief advisor and guide-out of the whole issues. And when they came to the thing, they said that the first thing that needs to be held was a census. That was not said by the government. It was said by the Electoral Commission, which was monopolized, or which was dominated by the opposition members. Simply because with the census, they want to upgrade the electoral roll. There are many youths who are not on the roll. And with that, when they came to cost it, it was seen that it was going to cost $1 billion US. Donors were called, donors agreed that they were going to give 700 million US dollars. And the government had was going to put in 300 million US dollars. Today, the government has put in 200 million US dollars. That 100 million US dollars, the government said it does not have it because of problems, basically fighting a war on the eastern side of the country, and also the fall in copper prices. But the donors, there's not a cent that has come from the donors. And the same standards which were set by the Independent Electoral Commission could be met, and the elections themselves could not be held. Now the mainstream media and the oppositions are blaming the government for that. Now that is a situation that people have got to look at very carefully.
Now, Mr. Khomo, we have to wrap up, but before that, I guess a good question would be, what lessons can we learn from this? I mean, initially when the discussion started, you took us through the Constitution, saying, a lot of the time the people in the DRC, argue on trivial matters, forgetting what the Constitution states. Another one is how elections, the election processes are held throughout the continent, but also what you mentioned in terms of trade relations between SADC countries. So just briefly, what can we learn from such discussions?
Well, I don't know if we have to learn. The only thing that we could say is this, that we should actually sort of look at issues much more deeply. We should not just take things on face value. I mean, with the DRC, with the elections, every whole blame is being put on the government of the DRC. Yet the government says, no, we have tried to do everything. We have actually not interfered with the Electoral Commission. They set the standards too high, which could not be met. And another thing is this, that with the bilateral commissions, I think they've got to continue, but basically this should actually be not even a bilateral, but there should be a regional agreement where we actually agree on basic principles and dealings amongst ourselves instead of they being from country to country.
Mr. Khomo, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
That was African politics analyst Izak Khomo joining me for a discussion on Kabila's visit to South Africa.